When a power-hungry HOA president blocks my driveway with her Mercedes, I turn her own rules against her, building a fence that traps her car and unravels her reign in an epic beachside showdown. Imagine inheriting a peaceful oceanfront cabin, only to discover it's the battleground for a tyrannical HOA president's ego. Little did I know, my calm resolve would dismantle her empire piece by piece. She was screaming something about community rights while standing in the middle of my driveway wearing a sequin beach cover-up and holding a clipboard like it was a weapon. And her Mercedes, her pride and joy, was parked directly across the only vehicle access to my oceanfront cabin, wheels turned just enough to block any hope of maneuvering around. I didn't yell. I didn't curse. I just stared at her, let the ocean breeze carry away the absurdity of the moment, and calmly asked one last time, "Karen, please move your car off my property." She smirked, lips pinched and smug like she'd won something. "This is HOA easement now, Mike. Get used to sharing." I turned, walked back inside, and dialed a tow company with the same serenity. "I might order a pizza." That was the moment the war began, not with a bang, but with a cold smile and a parking violation. And by the time I was done, not only would her car be gone, but the HOA that gave her power would be bleeding money, and she'd be sobbing as I fenced her vehicle into a personal sand prison under the law she weaponized. It all started 3 months ago when I inherited my late uncle's oceanfront property. A modest wooden cabin perched on a pristine sliver of shoreline that never once felt like it belonged to civilization. I left the city behind for quiet, for sea air, for healing. But what I stepped into was less a peaceful community and more a beachside bureaucracy run by a woman with more rules than compassion. Karen McDougal wasn't just any neighbor. She was the self-appointed president of the Beachside Dunes Homeowners Association, a group of 5 individuals who met monthly in lawn chairs, but spoke with the tone of city planners. The first time I met her, she delivered a binder the size of a Bible filled with codes, guidelines, and community etiquette. I accepted it politely. I never read it. "That's where I went wrong," she would later say. Though really my mistake was underestimating how far someone like her would go to prove a point. I kept to myself, made small improvements to the place, cleaned up driftwood, restored the fencing that had collapsed along my private drive, and spent most mornings sipping coffee with my boots in the sand. But the peace didn't sit well with her. She began with polite suggestions. "Turn your porch light off by 10. No surfboards left on the deck. Trim the dune grass lower." I ignored them all. Then came the citations, official-looking papers taped to my door with acronyms and threats of fines. The problem, the HOA's map showed a shared easement over a strip of my driveway, which was completely false according to the county record. My uncle had his property grandfathered in long before the HOA ever formed. The driveway was mine, the entire thing. Karen didn't care. When I asked her to stop taping things to my door, she responded with a community bulletin email accusing me of being aggressively antisocial. A few days later, during one of her community walks, she stopped in front of my cabin, stared at my Jeep, and loudly declared to another board member that the new guy was eroding community values. I laughed it off. I thought she'd get bored, but it turns out petty tyrants thrive on being ignored. So, the next escalation came without warning. One afternoon, I returned from a supply run in town only to find her Mercedes SL parked diagonally across my driveway. At first, I thought it was a delivery error or a friend of a neighbor. I knocked on doors. Nothing. Then I heard her voice behind me lilting in fake sweet. "Oh, Mike, I hope you don't mind. We're having a board meeting at my place and parking's tight. It's just a temporary community arrangement." Her eyes twinkled with venom. "Besides, it's technically not all your driveway, right?" I didn't answer. I just walked around her car, climbed the small bluff back to my porch, and reviewed the documents my uncle left me. I found the original plot map, county sealed, dated back to 1972. There it was in black ink. Private access road, parcel 47B, exclusive use. Her car wasn't on shared land. It was squarely on private ground. That's when I made the call. The tow truck arrived 25 minutes later. Karen screamed when she heard the hydraulic lift. She ran out, flailing her clipboard, shouting at the driver, who calmly pointed at the private property sign and invoice. She turned to me with desperation. "You can't do this. This is harassment. I'll report you." I just nodded. "You go right ahead. I'll be sending the bill to the HOA." 2 days later, she received the invoice for $386.87 towing, storage, and delivery. She refused to pay. I forwarded it to the HOA treasurer with a letter stating the incident and including the original deed copy. That's when things began unraveling. Turns out the HOA had a limited discretionary budget, mostly used for landscaping and annual event. My bill was enough to freeze up the summer party fund. Members weren't happy, but Karen doubled down. She hosted a driveway awareness meeting with flyers claiming my property was a shared access path under revised HOA mapping. She presented a crudely photoshopped diagram during the meeting that showed a blue-shaded community zone over my land, but she didn't expect someone to leak a video of the original digital HOA maps. Maps that never included my parcel in any shared capacity. The video surfaced online and suddenly neighbors who once waved politely now looked at her like she was a liability. But even that didn't stop her. The next week I found handmade signs planted along my driveway that read reserved for HOA business and community parking access. That's when I got my surveyor involved. A quiet man named Dennis who arrived with a drone, GPS gear, and a determination I admired. By sunset, Dennis had marked my boundaries with orange flags right down to the inch. He gave me a signed copy certified. "You want to build a fence?" he asked. "Because this is airtight." I nodded. Time to draw a line she can't ignore. Karen watched from her porch as I began digging post holes. She thought it was decorative. She thought wrong. Within 48 hours, I had a permit, materials, and a plan. And before she could make another move, she found herself on the wrong side of it. Literally, her shortcut to the beach, her favorite parking stunt, and even her view were all about to disappear behind 6 feet of treated lumber and one iron gate with a keypad. And she still didn't know I had just submitted a lien to recoup the towing cost directly from the HOA's operating account. She blocked my driveway. Now, I was going to block her out of every inch of mine. And I wasn't even angry, just methodical, calm, patient, like the ocean that slowly, inevitably swallows everything built too close to its edge. Karen hadn't parked in my driveway since the tow truck humiliated her in front of the entire neighborhood. But that didn't mean she'd learned anything. If anything, her behavior mutated from entitled to cunning, and what followed was not a ceasefire, but a silent escalation. She had stopped using brute force tactics like blocking my path, and instead started infecting the minds of the HOA board and neighbors with sweet smiling lies, passive-aggressive notices, and thinly veiled threats disguised as community concern. I noticed the shift when my dune grass, once untouched and wild, began appearing flattened every morning. Small footprints zigzagging through it as if someone had wandered through without a care. Then I found wrappers, cigarette butts, and even a discarded coffee cup beside my deck. At first, I thought maybe it was kids or careless tourists, but no one besides the residents knew how to access that path from the dunes without triggering my motion light. And then one morning I caught her. She was walking her Pomeranian through the high grass, leash dangling as if it was a free-range chicken, letting it relieve itself by my back stairs. When I opened the door and asked her what she was doing, she looked up calm as glass and said, "Just letting the community enjoy what should be shared." Mike, the dog, barked. She smiled. And I realized she wasn't just trespassing. She was making a statement. The next morning, I found a laminated sign nailed to the utility pole just outside my property line. It read, "Community Beach Trail Access Courtesy of the HOA." No authorization, no vote, no map changes, just a laminated lie hanging under my sky. I tore it down, marched to the HOA bulletin board on the corner of Driftwood Lane, and found an entire section newly added with a printed community notice that declared my driveway to be a temporary shared access point due to limited beach routes. It was dated, stamped with Karen's signature and backed by a statement that the board had unanimously agreed. I knew that couldn't be true because I had spoken to Sandra the treasurer just a few days ago and she had mentioned being left out of recent discussions. That gave me my first clue that Karen was starting to operate outside protocol. I contacted Sandra and asked her point blank whether the HOA had voted to share access through my land. Her answer was not only no, but also laced with enough frustration that I could tell she was getting tired of being steamrolled by Karen's self-righteous crusade. She even hinted that she suspected funds were being misused for events no one ever approved. It was time to get proactive. I reviewed the bylaws Karen had stuffed in my mailbox on my first week here, and while most of it was dry legal sludge, one particular clause caught my attention. Section 4.7 stated that any physical alteration of communal property had to be approved by a 2/3 board majority and documented with receipts and contracts. That seemed irrelevant until I remembered seeing landscaping trucks near Karen's house every other Friday. Curious, I hired a private contractor, someone not from the community, to pose as a potential landscaper and inquire about HOA-funded work. Within 2 days, I had photos of Karen directing a team to trim her personal hedges, pressure wash her deck, and repaint her mailbox, all billed as community beautification. With Sandra's quiet permission, I reviewed the expense records and found more than $3,000 labeled as shared exterior improvement funds, all for work done exclusively on Karen's home. Now armed with both legal documentation of my private land and financial proof of HOA fraud, I sent a polite but firm email to every board member detailing my findings. I included receipts, drone footage of her landscaping crew, and a screenshot of the forged map with her signature on it. I made no demands, no threats, only a request for clarification and a friendly reminder that my driveway was private property protected by county record. The fallout was immediate. Karen called me within an hour of the email being circulated, her voice trembling with mock calmness. "You're misinterpreting those records, Mike," she said. "You don't understand how community budgets work." I let her speak. I said nothing until she finished her rehearsed rant about unity, cooperation, and legacy. Then I simply said, "You parked on my land, forged HOA documents, and used HOA money to wash your deck. You've got bigger problems than my interpretation." She hung up. But I wasn't naive enough to think that logic would stop her. The next morning, I found 2 orange parking cones at the foot of my driveway with laminated cards taped to them, reading, "Reserved for HOA maintenance vehicle." She wasn't trying to access the land anymore. She was trying to confuse the neighbors, make it look like something legitimate was happening. So, I took a new approach. I hired Dennis again, the surveyor, and this time, we walked the property together with a high-precision GPS device. He remarked that Karen's walkway, built 3 years ago, actually encroached 4 feet into a protected runoff zone, something the county wouldn't take lightly. That detail gave me another card to play. I scheduled a visit with the city planning office under the pretext of a land dispute inquiry and shared my findings. Turns out the runoff zone was part of a protected wetland strip and had specific restrictions regarding foot traffic, paving, and construction. Karen's walkway wasn't just annoying, it was illegal. I returned home that afternoon with the wind at my back and a strategy forming in my mind. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the waves, I installed a small motion-activated camera hidden beneath the eaves of my porch. If Karen or anyone else stepped onto my land again, I would have footage. The following day, I marked the entire length of my property with biodegradable boundary flags from the county planning office. Bright, unmistakable, legal. Karen stood on her porch, arms folded, her face tight with disbelief as I walked the line and stuck each marker into the sand with deliberate patience. When I reached the edge of her walkway and placed the final flag just beyond it, I heard her voice carry over. "You're being aggressive, Mike. This is harassment." I didn't respond. I just raised my hand and waved gently without turning. The next afternoon, a code compliance officer arrived at her doorstep with a clipboard and a notice to inspect her walkway. And yet, the best part of it all was still to come. I had ordered fencing materials a week ago, and they were scheduled to arrive in 2 days. Posts, treated wood, iron hinges, and a beautiful keypad gate. It would be temporary at first, just a symbolic barrier to reinforce the boundaries she refused to acknowledge. But once the inspector verified my claim, I'd be cleared to make it permanent. The delivery date was marked in red on my calendar, and I counted the hours like a man awaiting vindication. Karen had maneuvered like a queen across a chessboard, smug and entitled, believing every neighbor was a pawn. But I wasn't a pawn. I was the end of the board. And now her king was cornered. Evening fell with the scent of salt and justice. I stood on the porch, watching the flagged lines glow in the golden hour, thinking about how quiet it would be once the fence stood tall. The ocean didn't belong to anyone, but the land did, and mine had borders now. Tomorrow, she'd see tomorrow the wood would arrive. Tomorrow, everything would change. The fencing truck arrived just after sunrise, its engine rumbling like a declaration of sovereignty, and I greeted the crew with quiet satisfaction as they unloaded each post and panel with mechanical precision. The materials were exactly what I had ordered: treated cedar, weather-sealed iron, powder-coated hinges, and as they set up their tools, I handed them the surveyor's signed boundary documents and the county permit tucked in a plastic sleeve. No room for interpretation, no space for objection. This was going to be done by the book. Karen watched the entire process from her kitchen window. I could feel her gaze through the glass, a mixture of disbelief and boiling frustration building behind her designer curtains. She didn't say a word, not at first. She just lingered like a ghost behind that window while the crew marked the posts with bright orange chalk, each one aligning perfectly with the boundary flags Dennis and I had placed days earlier. When the first post hit the ground, sunk deep with a vibrating auger that groaned against the earth, she finally emerged from her porch with her phone raised and her jaw locked. "You can't do this," she said to no one in particular, filming like she was a journalist uncovering corruption. One of the crewmen glanced at her, then at me, unsure whether to respond. I waved him off. "Let her film," I said. "She's just documenting her own failure." By noon, half the fence stood tall, creating a distinct separation between my land and the artificial sense of entitlement Karen had been projecting for months. It wasn't just physical, it was psychological. She had built her authority not on law, but on illusion, convincing everyone that her HOA status gave her dominion over shared space. But there was no shared space here. Not anymore. This fence turned that fantasy into a visible boundary, one she couldn't cross without consequences. The real unraveling began when she tried to rally the other board members to her side that afternoon. She held an emergency HOA meeting on her deck, called it a crisis of community overreach, and invited anyone willing to listen. Only 2 people showed up. Ted, who always brought store-bought brownies to potlucks, and Melissa, who rarely spoke but had once told me she regretted voting Karen in as president. They sat uncomfortably on folding chairs as Karen launched into a tirade about aggressive fencing tactics and unauthorized construction on communal terrain, her voice growing more shrill with each fabricated phrase. But then Melissa interrupted, holding up a printed email I had sent days earlier. The one with the legal documentation, the drone footage, and the HOA expense report that exposed Karen's landscaping grift. "I read it all," Melissa said. "He's not the one who's out of line." Karen froze. Ted shifted in his seat, and just like that, the cracks widened. The next morning, a new sign appeared on the bulletin board. One of those plastic sleeve flyers Karen loves to laminate. It was titled "Call to Action, Stop the Fence." It claimed I was constructing a fortress that divided the neighborhood, that my property was under review, and that further building would be met with legal recourse. The irony was so thick, I almost laughed. She was threatening legal action against someone following the law to undo her illegal nonsense. I took a photo of the flyer, then added a copy of my permit next to it with a handwritten note. County approved. Fence completion scheduled. Questions? See me directly. That was when the neighborhood started waking up. People I barely knew, quiet residents who kept their heads down, began stopping by. Some offered polite nods, others subtle thumbs-ups. A few even asked if they could do something similar to block HOA overreach on their own properties. Karen's illusion of control was crumbling, and the more she shouted, the more invisible she became. Her next move, however, was pure desperation. Around sunset, I returned from town to find a series of paper cones tied with string and fluttering in the wind, staked along the edge of the property line. Each cone held a printed sheet titled "Petition for Community Access Corridor." It was another attempt to weaponize paperwork, another illusion of bureaucracy. She'd printed dozens and left them along the road like propaganda. But when I checked the signature section on the first sheet, only her name appeared, and even that was shaky, as if she had signed it while panicking. I collected every copy, photographed them, and forwarded the images to Sandra, who replied with a single sentence. I'm scheduling a special vote to audit her actions. Then came the moment I had not anticipated, and perhaps the most telling of all. Karen approached the fence directly once the last panel had been secured and the gate locked with its freshly installed keypad. She didn't shout this time. She didn't film. She simply stood on the other side, hands and fists, lips trembling as she stared through the iron grid. "You really think this will stop me?" she asked. I walked up, rested a hand on the gate, and answered with complete calm. "No, but it will slow you down long enough for the truth to catch up." She said nothing. Just turned around and walked away, the wind catching her hair like a flag being lowered in defeat. But I knew she wasn't done. People like Karen never back down. They find new angles, new shadows to hide behind. That night, my motion camera caught her walking through the dunes just after midnight, flashlight in hand, inspecting the backside of the fence, perhaps looking for a weakness, an oversight. But I had built this to last, and every bolt, every post, every inch of wire mesh had been reinforced with the same precision I once used in designing offshore platforms. I knew how to build things to survive storms. This wasn't just a fence. It was a message. 3 days passed with an eerie silence. No new flyers, no trespassing, not even passive-aggressive emails. I thought maybe, just maybe, she had realized the futility of it all. But then I received a letter in the mail, not from Karen directly, but from a local mediation attorney who claimed to represent a concerned collective of community stakeholders. The letter invited me to an informal meeting to discuss property harmony, a phrase so absurd I had to reread it twice. I declined the invitation. I didn't need harmony. I needed peace. And peace comes from boundaries. But the story didn't end there. Not even close. Because the day after I declined the invitation, I received a visit from 2 officers from County Code Enforcement. Polite, professional, but clearly following up on a complaint. "We're here to inspect potential violations of zoning code. March 18, 12 concerning obstructive barriers near wetlands," one of them said. I smiled and led them around the property, showed them the surveyor's documentation, the original deed, the elevation maps, and the permit numbers. 10 minutes later, the senior officer nodded and said, "Looks good here. You've actually protected the runoff buffer better than most residents." Before they left, I asked if they'd mind sharing the origin of the complaint. They exchanged glances. Then one of them said, "It was anonymous, but the address matched your neighbor to the north." I nodded. Of course, it did. The silence didn't last. I knew it wouldn't. When people like Karen get cornered, they don't disappear. They mutate. Their tactics shift from loud declarations to quiet sabotage, from public stunts to private revenge. So, when I heard the distant hum of a car idling at the bottom of my hill at 6 a.m., I already knew it was her before I even looked. I walked out onto my porch, coffee in hand, and sure enough, there she was, parked directly outside my newly installed gate, her Mercedes purring like an animal about to lunge. She stepped out wearing an immaculate white windbreaker, oversized sunglasses, and a plastic smile stretched across her face like cheap wallpaper. She approached the gate slowly, casually, and without a word tried the keypad. Naturally, it didn't respond. Only I had the code. She pretended to fiddle with the buttons, then turned to me with exaggerated confusion. "Oh dear," she called out. "I think the keypad is malfunctioning. Could you let me through? I have a beach yoga group starting soon. And this is still part of our designated access point, isn't it?" I didn't answer. I just sipped my coffee and turned back toward the house. She didn't like that. Seconds later, I heard the metallic thud of her hand pounding on the gate. I ignored it, but not before making a mental note to check the welds on the hinges later. 2 hours passed. When I returned from a walk up the trail, her car was gone. But she had left something behind. Taped to the gate, flapping in the breeze, was a bright red warning notice. Fake, of course, emblazoned with an imaginary HOA seal and covered in pseudo-legal jargon about non-compliance with community access easement statutes. I pulled it off, crumpled it into my pocket, and laughed as I walked back inside. But the real surprise came later that afternoon. I had gone into town for supplies, and when I returned, her Mercedes was once again parked inside my driveway on my side of the gate. She had waited for a delivery van to leave, then zipped through before the gate had fully closed. Her car sat there like a trophy, deliberately angled to block the full length of the drive, its glossy silver finish gleaming with arrogance. And then to top it all off, she had the audacity to lock it and walk away toward the dunes with a beach towel slung over her shoulder like this was some kind of victory lap. I stood there for a moment, stunned at the boldness of it. She had trespassed, violated every warning, and dared me to react. And I did, but not the way she hoped. I didn't scream or confront her. I didn't post on the bulletin board or send angry emails. Instead, I picked up my phone and made 2 calls. The first was to the same private towing company I had used before. The one familiar with my property lines and paperwork. I sent them the updated coordinates, the timestamped security footage, and a copy of the latest deed with digital boundary overlays. They confirmed a driver could arrive within the hour. The second call was to my attorney. Just a quick heads up. She's on your land again? He asked. Locked and parked, I said. He chuckled. Want to file a civil trespass claim or just go for the towing charge first? Let's do both, I replied. Time to fence her in. But this time, I had something different in mind. When the tow truck arrived, I met the driver and explained the situation. He scratched his head, looking at the sleek Mercedes behind the gate. You sure you want this one towed? Or I shook my head. Not this time. I want it trapped. I want her to see what it feels like when the gate swings closed on her nonsense. I walked over to the fence pile and brought out 3 spare panels and a set of quick lock bracket. Within 20 minutes, we had boxed her car in using the very same materials I had installed on the rest of the fence. 1 panel went behind the vehicle, the others on each side. Not a scratch on the car, not an ounce of damage, just a perfect wooden cage around her 4-wheeled entitlement. The last touch was a small printed sign stapled to the back panel. Private property vehicle impounded by boundary enforcement. Storage fees may apply. Karen returned an hour later with a smoothie in hand and a sun hat flopping lazily on her head. She didn't even notice the fence at first. She was too busy fumbling with her key fob. Then she froze mid-step, her mouth slowly opening as she realized her car had been fenced in like a spoiled poodle locked in a display case. She screamed a guttural high-pitched wail that echoed across the beach like a fire siren. You psychotic maniac! You've imprisoned my car, she shrieked, running to the fence and rattling the panels with both hands. I stepped out onto the porch calmly and waved. Hi Karen, welcome to Real Property Law. I hope your smoothie doesn't melt while you're on hold with your lawyer. She tried calling the police, of course, claimed unlawful detainment, vandalism, harassment, anything she could think of. But when the officer arrived, he was the same one who'd responded during the first towing incident. He walked the property, inspected the fence, reviewed the permit on the gate, and returned to her with a shrug. Ma'am, the vehicle is on private property. The owner has the right to secure it as long as there's no damage and no intent to harm. Intent to harm? He fenced in my car like a barn animal, she shouted. That's emotional damage. The officer turned to me. You want to press trespassing charges this time? Already in motion, I said, handing him a printed copy of the filing. Karen's face twisted into a mask of disbelief. This is insane. I'm the HOA president, the officer raised an eyebrow. Not according to the treasurer I spoke with. There's a vote to suspend your position pending audit review. She stammered, looking like she might faint, then spun on her heels and stormed back to her porch in furious silence. I left her car exactly where it was for 2 more days. I wanted every neighbor who passed by to see it fenced in like some kind of abstract art installation titled Entitlement in Captivity. Kids pointed. Tourists snapped pictures. Even Ted, the brownie guy, stopped by and whispered, "This is better than cable." On the 3rd day, I received an official HOA letter, not from Karen, but from Sandra, now acting president, stating that the board had unanimously voted to relieve Karen of all duties pending financial review. Sandra included a handwritten note that simply said, "We've had enough." Thank you. I finally called the tow company back and had them remove the fencing panels, then allowed Karen's vehicle to be towed. This time with her full knowledge. She stood on her porch as the truck pulled away, arms limp at her sides, her face blank with humiliation. After it was gone, I swept the driveway clean, repainted the gate frame, and installed a camera inside a weatherproof box just above the keypad. Every inch of my property was now monitored, secured, and untouchable. Karen hadn't said a word in days. No flyers, no meetings, no late-night sabotage. She had withdrawn into her fortress of stucco and silence, but I knew the storm inside her hadn't passed. It was gathering strength, waiting for one last act of desperation. But I was ready because the war she had started over one stretch of sand had transformed into something bigger, something permanent. This wasn't. I knew the silence wouldn't hold. Karen's humiliation had curdled into something darker, something bitter that needed a new outlet. Now that her presidency was crumbling, and her car had been paraded out like an exhibit in the Museum of Consequences, it wasn't in her nature to let things end quietly. She needed a win, a final move, something that could reclaim the illusion of control she had lost piece by piece. And sure enough, her next move came not in the form of a public stunt, but through the slow, calculated drip of misinformation and bureaucratic manipulation. It started with a county letter marked in red, one that claimed a complaint had been filed against me for violating coastal preservation regulations. At first, I thought it was spam until I noticed the wording matched the obscure bylaws Karen had once quoted from her oversized binder. The letter said I had obstructed a historical walking path that may have run through my property decades ago. It was an old claim, flimsy at best, but enough to trigger an inspection and stall any future additions to the fence. She had used her last connections in the county's clerical sludge pile to throw sand in the gears. The inspector, who arrived, was polite, tired-looking, and already apologizing for wasting my time before he stepped onto the property. "It's a nuisance complaint," he said bluntly. "We get these when someone with a grudge tries to use ancient maps to stir up trouble." I showed him the updated survey, the certified documents, the county permit, the photographic records, the aerial drone footage. Everything stacked like a fortress of paperwork built precisely for moments like this. He nodded as he reviewed it, impressed and slightly amused. "You're more organized than we are," he muttered. Before leaving, he added something that made me pause. "There's been a string of complaints filed under anonymous names. But the handwriting looks awfully similar. You wouldn't happen to know a Karen M. who lives nearby, would you?" I smiled, not because I was happy, but because even the officials were starting to connect the dots. Karen wasn't playing chess anymore. She was throwing marbles under my feet, hoping I'd trip. But she had no idea how stable I'd made my footing. The next twist, though, came from a direction even I hadn't expected. Sandra, the treasurer turned acting president, requested a meeting. Not a casual doorstep conversation, not a whispered update in passing, but a full sit-down at the community pavilion. The same space Karen had once ruled like a plastic throne room. When I arrived, I found Sandra already seated with two other board members, both holding printed ledgers and marked-up folders. She motioned for me to sit and without pleasantries, she began. "We're conducting a full audit of the HOA's expenses over the last 18 months. We've discovered Karen used nearly 40% of the discretionary funds for work done on her home, private landscaping, and phony community improvements that only benefited her." She handed me a highlighted receipt list and my eyes traced through line items like exterior tile replacement, deck resurfacing, private yoga instructor, community health program. I looked up and asked, "What does this have to do with me?" Sandra leaned forward, calm but sharp. "You started the chain. Your evidence exposed the first crack. Now we're digging into everything." I felt something shift then, not just in the room, but in the entire balance of power. Karen's grip on the community wasn't just slipping. It was dissolving. And the board, once her loyal echo chamber, was now repurposing that energy into a purge. I thought about walking away from the mess. At that point, thought maybe, just maybe, I could let the board handle her, let the county close in on her walkway violation and return to my peaceful mornings of coffee and seabird. But then fate gave me a gift. Dennis, my trusty surveyor, texted me a photo. It showed a metal stake buried beneath decorative gravel just beyond Karen's property line. When he dug it up, he found a rusted property boundary marker with initials stamped into the side dating back more than 20 years. Next to it, embedded in the cement base, was a plastic tag from a long-defunct contracting firm. Dennis had been reviewing historical footage and realized the path Karen built. Her prized stone walkway that wrapped around the dunes was actually several feet outside her permitted line. I stared at the photo for a long time, not because of what it meant, but because of what it proved. Karen had knowingly built over protected land and then buried the evidence under cosmetic landscaping. That wasn't negligence. That was concealment. That was calculated. The next day, I submitted the photo along with Dennis's report to the county environmental office. I expected it would take weeks to process. It took 2 days. On the third morning, a pair of county inspectors arrived in a white truck with green seals on the doors. They knocked on Karen's door with clipboards in hand while I sipped my coffee on the porch and watched the scene unfold like a slow-moving courtroom drama. She opened the door, wearing a robe and sunglasses again, looking more fragile than usual. They spoke quietly. She gestured toward the dunes, trying to explain, but the inspectors had already pulled up satellite overlays and matched them against Dennis's coordinate. After an hour of measurements and clipped conversation, they left her with a notice and a yellow plastic flag stuck directly into the corner of her walkway. I couldn't hear what she muttered as they drove off, but I didn't need to. The way she slumped against her doorway and looked at that yellow flag like it was a guillotine was all the confirmation I needed. Later that afternoon, I received another letter. This one hand-delivered by Sandra herself. It was formal notice that Karen had been officially removed from all HOA duties effective immediately. Sandra apologized for the delay and told me a reimbursement fund had been set up for members affected by Karen's misuse of resources. "We're trying to fix what she broke," she said quietly. "Including trust." I thanked her, but I wasn't finished yet. I still had one move left. The lien I had filed for the original tow bill had finally processed, and I now had legal grounds to collect the debt either through HOA payment or small claims court. I chose the latter. It wasn't about the money. It was about the principle, about making sure the next person who tried what she did would think twice. Court was uneventful. She didn't show. The judgment was awarded in my favor in less than 10 minutes. The court clerk handed me the stamped paper and said, "Congratulations. Looks like you won." I nodded, but I didn't feel triumphant. I felt complete. Like a storm had passed, and all that was left was the soft, salty air of the beach and the rustling of dune grass finally left alone. That evening, I walked the property line one more time. The fence stood strong. The gate clicked securely. No new signs, no red flyers, no cones, just peace. I lit a fire in the pit and sat back with a cold drink, watching the smoke rise into a sky finally free of threat. Karen hadn't been seen in 3 days. Her house sat quiet and dark, curtains drawn, mailbox full. Rumor had it she was preparing to move, her name quietly disappearing from the HOA roster. The sky had that pale gray stillness that always preceded a storm. And though the ocean whispered calm, the neighborhood was vibrating with something tense and unpredictable. I could feel it when I walked down Driftwood Lane. The way conversations cut short when I passed. The way porch lights blinked on even though it was barely dusk. Karen had vanished from public view for nearly a week. But her name lingered like smoke on lips, in whispers, in the nervous glances of HOA board members and longtime residents who had once followed her blindly. I didn't need confirmation to know she was planning something. She was too proud to fade quietly, too entitled to accept defeat without a final strike. And that strike came on a Thursday morning, not with a bang, but with a stack of photocopied letters stuffed into every mailbox in the community. It was a full-page manifesto titled "The Truth About Mike Taylor, a Threat to Our Community," and it read like the final scream of a collapsing empire. She accused me of coercion, of illegal fencing, of blackmailing the board into turning on her. She claimed I had used military-grade surveillance on neighbors, tampered with county records, and manipulated HOA politics for personal gain. And at the bottom, she signed it boldly beneath the printed words, "Former HOA President, Resisting Tyranny." I didn't laugh. I didn't even get angry. I just stood there on my porch, letter in hand, while the wind flipped its corners like an exhausted metronome. I knew exactly what this was. It wasn't a counterattack. It was a last gasp, a desperate grasp at relevance from someone whose world had shrunk to the walls of a house she no longer ruled. But I underestimated how much chaos one desperate person could still unleash. That same evening, 2 cars drove slowly by my property. Not the usual beach cruisers or tourist rentals. These were tinted window SUVs crawling past the gate with the kind of scrutiny that didn't come from curiosity, but from intention. At first, I thought they might be private investigators some ill-advised stunt Karen had paid for. But when I followed up the next morning with a call to the county office, I learned something far more interesting. Karen had submitted a request for an injunction claiming the fence and gate had obstructed community access, thereby damaging her property value. It was a legal Hail Mary, one that relied entirely on the old fake maps she had doctored months ago. But the system had to respond, and so a hearing was scheduled, not in criminal court, not even in small claims. It was a zoning hearing, just formal enough to cause trouble, just minor enough to be ignored by most, but not by me. I prepared like it was war. I gathered everything. Satellite images, historic plat maps, land surveys, Dennis's notarized documents, drone footage, emails from HOA members, the towing invoice, the permit receipts, even the video of Karen parking illegally and screaming when her car was boxed in. I organized them into a hardbound binder with tabs and annotations, then made 4 identical copies. I dressed in quiet grays the day of the hearing, calm and exact, while Karen arrived in a flowing floral dress with heels too high for the pavement, clutching a manila envelope stuffed with emotion and little else. The board members sat at the folding tables under fluorescent lights in the community center while we faced each other across the room. A quiet hush settling over the attendees. I didn't speak first. Karen did, and she spoke with fire. She painted a picture of a community under siege, of a newcomer imposing barriers and silencing her voice. She pointed at me as if I were a criminal and closed her statement with a trembling voice that almost passed for sincerity. But then I stood in calmly, without theatrics. I let the facts do the talking. I showed the maps, the signatures, the property line photos. I played the video of her faking signage. I passed around Dennis's certified report. And when I was done, I simply said, everything I built was within the law. Everything she tried to take was not. The silence that followed was the kind that carries weight, not from volume, but from collapse. Karen's shoulders slumped before the verdict was even delivered. The board unanimously denied her request, and worse for her, forwarded the file to the County Planning Commission for further review of her walkway violations. She left without a word. No storming, no shouting, just a slow, defeated walk to her car as the rain finally started to fall. Soft at first, then steady like the world was washing itself of her presence. But I wasn't done. Not because I wanted more, but because her letter had crossed a line. Public defamation, printed and distributed, carried legal weight, and I had proof. That afternoon, I filed a civil defamation claim with supporting evidence. Not to collect money, not to crush her further, but to send a message that actions had consequences, that silence wasn't the same as surrender. A week later, I received a notice that she had voluntarily listed her property for sale. Her name no longer appeared on any HOA document. Her house, once a monument to control, now sat with a discreet real estate sign out front and the windows tightly shuttered like a queen fleeing her own castle under the cover of dusk. The community changed after that. Slowly but undeniably, neighbors who once avoided eye contact now waved without tension. The HOA, under Sandra's steady guidance, held meetings with real votes, real transparency. People smiled more. The beach felt quieter. One afternoon, Melissa dropped off a pie with a note that read, "Thanks for drawing the line." Even Ted, in his shy way, brought over a bottle of wine and said, "Glad you stayed." And I did stay. Not out of stubbornness, not for revenge, but because I had earned something rare in a place like this. Peace that was not granted, but built. Earned not through shouting, but through steadiness. I added a second keypad to the side gate, painted the fence to match the dune tones, installed solar lights along the path, and even built a small bench overlooking the water. It bore no plaque, no statement, just smooth cedar and a view that didn't need defending anymore. Karen's car was never seen again. Her name, once spoken like a force of nature, faded into nothing but a cautionary tale. The defamation claim was resolved quietly with a formal retraction letter, which I never published. It wasn't about proving anything anymore. It was about knowing that I had responded to chaos, not with chaos, but with clarity. I looked out over the shoreline one evening as the tide pulled in like breath, soft and rhythmic, and thought about how strange it was that a driveway could become a battlefield, that a fence could become a symbol, that a war of property and power could leave behind something as simple and quiet as respect. The wind carried the last remnants of that war out to sea, and I let it go, because in the end, it wasn't the fence or the paperwork or the hearing that won. It was the line itself, the refusal to yield to noise, to threats, to manufactured authority. It was the silence I chose instead of shouting, the patience I held instead of panicking. And maybe that's what Karen never understood. You can scream all you want about control, about access, about power. But if you step beyond the line, if you trespass long enough, you'll eventually find yourself fenced in. Not by force, but by the quiet, deliberate hands of someone who simply refuses to move. The house sold faster than anyone expected. One morning, it still had its shutters drawn like it was holding its breath, and by the following week, a moving truck stood in front of it like a final statement. Karen didn't show her face, not even once during the transition. Everything was done through movers and agents, her belongings packed by hired hands, while the locals watched from behind curtains and fences, whispering not with malice, but with quiet disbelief that the era of her rule had actually ended. No goodbyes, no apologies, not even a passing glance. She left the same way she had tried to govern, distant, theatrical, and convinced of her own righteousness. I watched the truck pull away from my porch, its heavy wheels crunching gravel as it vanished down Driftwood Lane, and I felt a stillness settle over the land like fresh snow. Her car never returned. Her name never came up again in meetings. And when the property was relisted, it came with a modest sign that read, "Private sale by appointment only." As if even the house itself wanted some time to heal before accepting a new occupant, the neighborhood shifted subtly in her absence. The HOA meetings became community gatherings again, more potlucks than politics, filled with questions and laughter instead of decrees and laminated flyers. Sandra stepped into her role with a balance of patience and backbone that brought people together instead of splitting them apart. She worked with county officials to clarify the community boundaries. Even had a new set of maps drafted and distributed. This time accurate, official, and signed by every member present. And while she never spoke ill of Karen publicly, her commitment to rebuilding trust was proof enough that the old regime was behind us. I never once took a leadership role. I didn't need to. Just being present was enough. My fence remained solid and undisturbed, now accepted as part of the landscape rather than a provocation. Tourists walked past it, admired its craftsmanship, and took selfies at the overlook bench I had placed just beyond it. A few of the locals even asked for the contractor's name, wanting similar installations to mark their own boundaries, not out of conflict, but for clarity. Somehow, what had once sparked a war had become a symbol of peace. The county eventually finalized the environmental ruling against Karen's walkway, officially citing her for violation of wetland protections. Of course, by then she was already gone, and the financial penalty landed on the closing costs of her home sale. A quiet line in the contract, a final repayment extracted not by confrontation, but by process. When I read the notice in the public record, I didn't gloat. I just nodded like a chapter had been properly closed. Months passed, seasons shifted, and with each change, the neighborhood softened. The beach grew quieter in the mornings. The children ran freer without fear of scolding from a clipboard-wielding tyrant, and the porch lights glowed longer into the night. Conversations resumed between neighbors who had once only traded glances. There was no more fear of being targeted, no more whispered grievances or sudden citations. Peace doesn't come with an announcement. It comes slowly like the tide, reshaping everything without needing to shout. One evening, just as the sky turned the deep watercolor orange, Sandra joined me at the overlook bench with 2 cups of coffee in hand. We sat in silence for a while, watching the waves draw long silver lines across the horizon. Eventually, she said, "You know, when you first showed up, I thought you were going to be a problem." I smiled and sipped the coffee. You weren't wrong, but it turns out you were the solution instead. She handed me a folded paper creased and smudged from her pocket. It was a copy of Karen's original fake map, the one she'd altered to include my driveway as a shared easement. We found this in the HOA storage bin, she said. I thought you might want to burn it. I looked at the paper for a long time, felt the layers of false authority and gaslighting that it represented, and then simply folded it again and placed it on the bench beside me. No need, I said. It's already been erased by the truth. We finished the coffee in quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after a storm, not before it. Eventually, the house next door was bought by a young couple with a Labrador and a knack for barbecuing. They introduced themselves with a tray of grilled skewers and an open invitation to stop by any time. No rules, no forms, no suggestions about where I should park or how tall my dune grass should be. Just neighbors the way they should be. I helped them carry in a new porch swing one Saturday and realized with a small but solid sense of satisfaction that nothing in the world was blocking my driveway anymore. The gate swung open freely when needed and remained closed when it wasn't. It became a natural part of life, no longer a weapon, just a structure, like a memory that fades but leaves behind the wisdom of what not to repeat. In the final HOA meeting of the year, Sandra stood up with a short announcement that surprised everyone. She introduced a new amendment to the bylaws, unofficially dubbed the Boundary Clause, which clarified the exact rights of private property owners in relation to the HOA and restricted any president from acting without full board approval. It passed unanimously. No debates, no drama, just quiet agreement. Afterward, she looked across the table and met my eyes. A simple nod between people who had both seen what happens when lines are crossed without consequence. I never heard from Karen again. No letters, no lawsuit, no anonymous complaint. It was like she had evaporated or maybe just finally run out of people to manipulate. Sometimes I wondered what her new neighborhood was like, if her next community knew who they were dealing with, or if maybe somehow she had learned something from the fallout. But those thoughts never lasted long. The ocean always drew them away, replaced by the soft crash of waves and the rustling of dune grass in the breeze. Some stories don't need sequels. They just need to end and stay ended. As spring approached, I began planting wildflowers along the edge of the fence, letting color reclaim the space where battles once unfolded. Birds nested in the corners of the roof again, unbothered. The dune trail grew its grass back, and I let it grow a little wild, a little imperfect, the way it had been before all of this began. Perfection had never been the goal. Balance was respect, and that's what I had now. Not just from the community, but from the land itself. There were no more battles to win, no more documents to draft, no more meetings to endure, just the steady rhythm of life in a place that no longer feared its own rules. One night, as I sat on the porch watching the stars blink alive above the sea, I thought about how strange it was that all of this began with a single parked car. A small act of defiance, of arrogance that unraveled everything. And yet without it, the truth might have stayed buried beneath fake maps and pretty lies. Without it, the community might have continued to suffer under the weight of unearned authority. Sometimes it takes a confrontation to restore peace. Sometimes fence isn't just about keeping others out. It's about keeping something safe inside. And in the end, that's what I had done. Not waged war, not sought revenge, just built something that couldn't be moved, something real.